I wish this, I worked in TV and that things worked a little bit more smoothly than this. So I wish it were a little
for
easier.
anyone. So give us 2 seconds.
Okay. So we're live on YouTube. We've got Kyle Kondik here. You're the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, also a fellow OU Bobcat, which I was thrilled to find out. OU grads at
Bobcats.
It's a team I don't think any of us really rooted that hard for when we were there. I don't know about you, and I played sports there, so I probably should have rooted a little harder. But I'm just so thrilled to have you. When we booked you for after the debate last time, or when we booked you, I think we thought maybe we'll have some issues to talk about. Doesn't seem like America is going to be that kind to us and let us actually talk about issues. Dana Bash called it a shit show on CNN's air last night. I think I bled from my ears a little bit, and then just for kicks turned on subtitles to see how well they would work, and started bleeding from my eyes. So I thought we'd provide a little comic relief for everyone who might have watched and who was traumatized. So we're going to share some funny tweets. Claire Malone from 530, our friends over at 538, had a good one. Since I'm a woman, I think I can say, yep, it's true. Will wants to pull that one up. Or not. This may not work. This whole shtick that we had planned. Here we go. So Claire Malone, I think, said something to the effect of every woman, or what Chris Wallace knows what it's like to be a woman in every meeting now. So I don't think this shtick is going to work out quite as well as we thought. Mindy Kaling also tweeted about and said something to the effect of, I think everybody has written the word shit show or said the word shit show far more than we have in the past. And then there were lots of different suggestions about how to cut mics. Jessica Taylor over at Cook Political mentioned sliming people like Super Sloppy Double Dare, for anybody out there who remembers those days. I also thought maybe just like Spider-Man shooting webs at the candidates' faces might be interesting. Of course, this is all just fantasy because none of that's going to happen. But it does turn out, I think they're going to cut mics, right?
That it was the reporting that I saw a little bit earlier today, and I wonder if, I wonder if that'll prompt Trump not to want to come. I mean, I suspect that both Trump and Biden will both continue debating, because I do think that if you were to drop out, I don't think that would be a good look for either candidate. Yeah. Also, the next one in 2 weeks is like a town hall format, which I think maybe will lower the temperature just slightly, because the candidates will have to interact with the questioners from the crowd, although there's still going to be a lot of interplay between Biden and Trump, and the moderator is C-SPAN Steve Scully, who is used to dealing with crazy callers anyway.
Yeah,
I know Steve a little bit. He's a great guy, but I don't envy him in trying to moderate one of these debates.
Well, can you imagine how embarrassing it would be for a candidate to have their mic cut? I mean, we're at that place.
It's pretty bad, but I mean, again, the president's behavior was, it arguably merited it. And I mean, look, Biden got his hits in too, but I think part of it is that he was sort of goaded into doing that by Trump. I mean, and look, I mean, I think Trump was definitely trying to, what does the Trump campaign believe? They believe that Biden is not basically mentally fit to be president, that he's essentially too old to be president. That's what they basically say about him. Yeah. And so how do you convey that to the American public? Well, you try to force him into making mistakes and looking old in the debate. And I mean, look, I don't think this was some vintage great Joe Biden performance. I thought he was better, for instance, in his single debate against Bernie Sanders back in March. I thought that was Biden's best debate of all the endless litany of Democratic debates. That Biden was fine, basically. But Trump just can't, he can't stop making it all about himself. And that's fundamentally the problem, is that if you want to hurt Biden, you need people to be talking about Biden coming out of the debate. Instead, they're talking about Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so let's try to sort of dissect, what everybody called the dumpster fire, right? I think it's so funny to watch all of the like political journalists and everybody try to be really witty on Twitter after this, because we're all just nerds anyway. So in my mind, I'd love to hear what you think, but in my mind, elections are about sort of arguing best policies and trying to be the person who try to argue that you're supposed to be the best person to implement that policy, right? Like that's sort of and debates are this microcosm of that larger argument. With a surprisingly small number of undecided voters, who, if anybody, was won over last night?
Look, I think that the people who tune into debates may, in large part, be people who already have decided, and they're, they're partisans, and it's like, it's like turning on a football game and cheering for your respective team. In this case, you're just cheering for your respective candidate. I think CBS YouGov had a poll right before the debate, and they were asked people who plan to watch the debate, why are you doing it? And I think only 6% of respondents said, oh, it's because I'm undecided. I'm trying to make up my mind. We know that there's not that many undecideds. They're far fewer, I think, than in 2016, which might help the polls be a little bit more accurate in more places this time than maybe they were in 2016. I also think that undecided voters often are, and people also who identify as independents, true independents who don't lean toward one part or the other, they'll sometimes have kind of quirky political beliefs, and they also tend to follow politics a little bit less. And one also wonders if some of those folks tuned into the debate and essentially the debate prompted them to think, boy, the decision I'm going to make is a decision not to vote at all. Which undecided folks, that's one of the options available to them. Frankly, Trump is hurt more than Biden if some undecideds decide ultimately not to show up, because Trump's the one who needs more of the undecided vote because he's further away from 50% in the polls than Biden typically is.
Well, and I think on that sort of note, I'm curious, with these undecideds, you say they may decide not to vote, but are they, who are they and how do they decide to vote? Is it emotional? Is it one policy voters? Is it sort of the beer test? Like, do you want to have a beer with this guy? What is there a general consensus, or, are some of those swing voters, which I typically have been, are some of those swing voters just all over the map?
I think they're all over the map myself. I think now the one interesting thing is that the demographic makeup of the undecideds it does not necessarily suggest a lot of people from demographic groups that are very supportive of Trump. You do have a higher number of Latino voters who are undecided, and Latino voters they're not super duper Democratic, but it's definitely collectively a Democratic leaning group. You've got younger people who probably don't like Biden and maybe would prefer Bernie Sanders or some other candidate, but they really don't like Trump either. And so, when you look at the crosstabs of the poll and you see, one of the things I look at is like, what's the percentage of voters who are kind of white non-college who are undecided? That's a group that you think would break toward Trump, but it doesn't. In the polls I've looked at, in the crosstabs, again, I can't look at everything, but a lot of the stuff I've looked at, when I look at the undecided, they don't necessarily scream out as leaning one way or the other. And there's sort of a thought that undecided break against the incumbent. That I don't think that that's necessarily always true. We are in an era of pretty strong partisanship, and so it might be that if those undecideds have sort of latent, hidden partisanship, that maybe they just break in favor of whatever party they end up supporting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a commentary, and I just want to kind of have a little bit more kind of heady debate before we get into the deep, or not debate, just conversation before we get into the numbers. But I saw this commentary from the left that people thought Biden should have gone for a knockout on a couple issues. I certainly thought on the tax return question, he kind of whiffed it. It wasn't as strong as he could have been, and it was sort of served up pretty softly, I thought. But is that important ultimately in a debate? Is that what we should be looking for? What sort of decides if somebody wins or loses a debate?
I think in some ways it depends on what we sort of remember from the debate, and the press kind of helps us remember what we maybe what they think is important from the debate. And sometimes there could be sort of like a flashbulb moment that gets a lot of coverage. And a lot of people who maybe say that they watched the debate, maybe they didn't, but they saw a clip on YouTube about it, or they saw a report on Fox or CNN about the debate, and they'll see a clip here and a clip there. And so in some ways the press, and I think this is particularly true of the primary debates, where you don't have the anchor of partisanship for people to sort of filter the debates through, is that whatever the press is actually kind of an active participant in determining what's quote important and who quote wins. And there's actually, in terms of the primary debates, there's a lot of interesting research that suggests that in some ways the parties have essentially gotten out of the kind of controlling the nomination process, and they've handed that power to the media, which I think is fascinating, and I think there's something to it. And
Yeah.
but for these presidential debates in the general election, I think in some ways it's just what comes across as memorable. And by the way, you mentioned Biden and the tax issue, and going after Trump. I mean, again, I don't think Biden came off as all that great and all that focused. I mean, now on the other hand, if I think the Trump campaign for months has argued that again that Biden essentially is a non-functional human being, and that didn't come off. I mean, Biden, if that was your expectation going in, I think Biden probably impressed you, because he was fine in that regard, but he also wasn't like some sort of super polished performance. But that's also not who Joe Biden is anyway.
Well, and that's the whole thing about the DNC speech, right? That the lowering the expectations for Joe Biden has made him, where he's not always a coherent speaker in some cases, and can stumble and does kind of bounce around to different thoughts. And we saw that a little bit last night, but you kind of give him a pass with the bouncing around to different thoughts, because you're expecting him to go out there and soil himself based on the Trump, campaign expectations. So
yeah, and I mean, I really did think that Biden's convention speech or convention acceptance speech was excellent. I thought it was. Yeah. I mean, he's been around for so long, but I thought it was probably one of the best public appearances of his career. I mean, I think that when people survey it, they may point that out. But again, it also is, reading from teleprompter, basically. I mean, I thought it was a good speech. And look, I mean, some people are good at delivering those kinds of addresses and some people aren't. Personally, I think the president is much better off the cuff than when he's trying to deliver something from a teleprompter. I mean, I thought his delivery of his convention speech was not very good at all. And, but ultimately, again, how much does it matter? I don't know.
Yeah. To your point about, and I guess my question, we had David Litt on, who's one of Obama's former speechwriters, to this point about the media picking and, choosing these things. I'm a member of the press. Do you think it's good for a democracy for the media to be saying, I saw some tweets from reporters last night, so-and-so won, so-and-so lost. And I kind of cringed at them. I didn't think that was an appropriate place for a member of the press to be weighing in definitively.
And it's ultimately in the eye of the beholder. I mean, it's not like, it's not like we're scoring a fight or something, or, we're not all judges, and there's not going to be a winner. And look, I mean, sometimes the public will judge someone to be the winner of these debates, and then they don't even end up winning. I mean, Hillary Clinton, I think, generally did pretty well in the snap polls of the 2016 debates. I'd say particularly the first one. In fact, I think that the CNN poll, I think it was like 60-30 roughly, that said Biden did better, and that was almost identical to Clinton in the first debate last time. Now, what happened, I think, in 2016 is the electorate was more kind of fluid. The debates actually ended a little less than 3 weeks before the election, and the Comey letter come out and other things that I think probably did have some sort of impact on the race. There were actually even discussions, I think this has been reported, that of doing like a fourth debate in 2016, and I frankly think that would have helped Clinton, but obviously it never happened.
Yeah, I think that it seemed like the Clinton campaign probably felt like they had it far more in the bag than obviously they did.
Correct.
And so putting your candidate out beyond where she had the exposure she had already had wouldn't, when you're winning, why do more?
That's right. That's right.
So,
I mean, look, and I think Biden has sort of run his campaign that way too. I mean, it's not like he's not doing anything, but I think that the Trump folks have been sort of making fun of them for, calling a lid on, 8 o'clock in the morning or whatever. But at the same time, I think that from the Biden perspective, they look at the president and just say, hey, keep talking, know? And I'm sure that was their reaction to last night's debate too. Just, hey, just bring it on, keep talking. And, we're fine to just let you do whatever you want in that regard, because you're not, you're reminding people of why they don't like you.
And the enthusiasm for Trump versus the enthusiasm against him has been a really, I think, an interesting number to watch in this election, certainly. So based on our numbers last night, we've seen a tight election in North Carolina in the Electoral College, not as tight in the Senate race. But in the last month or so, the EC has gotten very close. This is the first time it's flipped since mid-August. And then Florida tightened up as well. I mean, these are sort of real-time results or real-time reactions from the debate. What's your take on why these are happening? Why North Carolina too? I think that was the most definitive one, and probably the most contentious one. I think you guys have North Carolina and a couple other states as toss-ups, right?
Yeah, and actually, I think there's a kind of a universally agreed upon list of sort of the 6 most important states in the election that are getting a lion's share of the attention and the visits from the candidates and the campaign ad spending dollars. And it's it's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and the industrial North, the 3 sort of keystone states from 2016 that kind of decided the election, and then North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona, the Sun Belt. My own sense, I think the polls back this up too, and potentially the odds. That North Carolina is the heaviest lift for Biden because the state is just sort of persistently stuck, a few points to the right of the nation. I can't tell you why there might have been a shift in North Carolina, although maybe if the feeling is that Biden is doing better overall and North Carolina is seen as one of the core swing states, then maybe it would make sense that Biden's odds should go up there too, because rising tide lifts all boats. That would be my one thought on it. The other thing is that North Carolina is arguably the most important Senate race in the whole country. In that, I would think that the winner of that race would at least have 50 seats in the Senate. Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, has actually lagged behind Trump there. And if I felt more confident in Biden winning North Carolina, I would think of Tillis as being a clear underdog. But I'm not that confident in Biden winning North Carolina. I do think it's like a very legitimate toss-up. I mean, your odds are basically 50-50, I think, and that sort of reflects my feeling on it too. I mean, and again, you have Florida rated that you're Florida with the same with the same value on it, and also those key industrial North states are all where Biden is favored by more, which I think makes sense to me. And I think that given that the reason Biden is doing better than Clinton performed is because he's doing better with white voters of all stripes, particularly in the North. And where are there a lot of white voters in the North? Well, the competitive states in the Midwest, and Biden seems to be doing really pretty well in those states. The thing I kind of worry about is, what if all these polls, and again, almost all of them are pointing in the same direction, what if they're just screwing up white voters? And it actually turns out that Trump's support amongst these voters is still good. If Trump wins, I suspect that will be part of the story. So it's something that I personally worry about, but I also, if in fact Trump voters are just like not being picked up in polls and are not participating, I don't even know how you would know that would, like Nate Cohn has talked about that. Like there's all this talk about the shy Trump voter or whatever, and that stuff has generally been debunked. But it's one thing if you've got someone who's voting for Trump who says that they're not in a poll, but what if these folks just aren't participating in the polls? Now, again, that's ultimately, it's just kind of it's sort of an unfounded thing, but it's a voice in the back of my head anyway.
Sure, and that's actually, to bring us to the next question, you tweeted this about the Trafalgar Group. Trafalgar, obviously the GOP pollster who's polling probably represents a best case scenario for Trump because it's actively trying to calculate a stride Trump vote. Now has him leading in Michigan. So, and it has him by 2, Pennsylvania 2. Sorry, I don't know why I'm getting called in the middle of this. Has him actively, if we can pull that up, we can pull up that there. Has Biden narrowly leading in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. What do you think that says? Do you think that matters?
Look, I mean, this Trafalgar, they sort of swept in at the end of the 2016 election. I'd never heard of them before, and they dropped all these polls in the Midwest that showed Biden doing pretty well, or sorry, showed Trump doing pretty well. Those states were, basically tied or whatever in their polling, which essentially reflected reality. And they have said that they basically have some sort of method in which they kind of try to calculate what they're seeing as sort of like a shy Trump vote. I think they maybe ask people how their friends and neighbors are voting or something like that. some people essentially look at Trafalgar and say, well, they're essentially just sort of like, they get a poll result and then they sort of, to use a term, unskew it to make it more Republican leaning. But I don't think they've been. It's not entirely clear what they're really doing. I don't think, but I do pay attention to them because I do think they kind of represent essentially kind of the worst case scenario polling out there for Biden. And
Yeah.
I want to know what the good polls say, the polls that are good for Biden say about him. But I also am curious I want to see the numbers from everybody. And Trafalgar has had Trump in the past leading narrowly in some of these states. And I thought it was interesting that they have Biden up. And so if that represents the low end of whatever reality is, it probably means Biden really is leading in those states.
Yeah, I think it's just musing at how deeply nerdy this conversation could get, how fast. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the tipping point market, if we can pull that up, Will. We talked to David Byler earlier this week. He had some spreadsheets on the tipping point markets. Which one of these states, Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, blah, 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 which one? We have Pennsylvania leading. Is there one that you specifically think will be that tipping point for 270?
It was Wisconsin last time. And I think Wisconsin's a decent candidate. But I do think Pennsylvania is a pretty strong candidate too, in that I find it hard to believe that, particularly because it actually seems like Biden's doing a little bit better in Wisconsin than he is in Pennsylvania, although the polls in those states kind of look similar. But one of those three, key Midwestern states, I think would be a good candidate. Florida. Now, one, I guess, good thing about Florida is that you're getting more electoral votes. So it's I guess it's likelier that it's harder for like Nevada to be the tipping point state, even though Nevada is typically pretty reflective of the nation, just because it doesn't have a lot of electoral votes. Like in my book on Ohio called The Bellwether, I talked about these sort of the decisive state every year, and typically I don't think Nevada ever has been. This is from memory, so maybe I'm wrong about that, but part of it is just because it doesn't have that many electoral votes. And Nevada is sort of a sneaky upset pick for Trump. But let's say Biden kept all the Clinton states but lost Nevada, but then also won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He would still win the election under that circumstance. Biden or Trump would have to pick up New Hampshire too to get over 270 in that scenario. But I think the fact that Pennsylvania is sort of has the best odds of being the pick, that would also be my pick, frankly.
Yeah. With Ohio, and I talked also to Byler about this being the bellwether historically, the whole adage of you can't win an election without Ohio. It seems if we can pull up that Ohio market, Will, we've seen the odds change dramatically in Ohio. Is that a signal of, because it seemed like pretty, Trump won it fairly fair and square last election. Does that signal trouble for you?
Well, look, I mean, if Trump only wins Ohio by a point or two, it probably means he's losing Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin while that's happening, because the states were several points more Democratic in 2016, and historically those states have generally been a little bit more Democratic than Ohio has been. Personally, I wonder how much there were a couple polls on Thursday. Quinnipiac, I think, had Biden up 1, and Fox News had Biden up 5. I wonder if those polls kind of move the market a little bit. But I will tell you, like I wrote something about Ohio for the Crystal Ball on Thursday morning before those polls had come out, and I wrote that I still thought that Trump would win Ohio, and I basically still believe that. But in talking to some people in the state and some of the internal stuff, and I've heard this for months, the president's numbers in the suburbs are just really bad compared to how he performed in 2016. And again, you see that in other places too. And Ohio is the kind of state where the suburbs are not enough to flip the state to the Democrats. They need to pick up a little bit of lost ground in the Appalachian parts of the state and Northwest Ohio. And so they have to, do significantly better with, white voters who don't have a 4-year degree, a kind of white working class group. But again, poll after poll indicates that Biden is doing that, not just in Ohio, but in states like Maine and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. So again, maybe it's all wrong, or maybe that's actually happening. And that would position Biden really well to not only win the closest states from 2016, but also to win maybe Iowa and Ohio or both.
Well, and I think any other election that you've obviously studied and covered, and any other election I've covered, if you saw numbers like this, you could feel pretty confident and, oh yeah, that's what's going on. But I think 2016 scared all of us into not being too certain about what we think we're seeing, right?
Yeah, I think we have to be cognizant of the sort of possibility for polling problems. Although again, someone like me is I'm so dependent on polls, and I'm not paying for them,
Yeah.
I really try to be appreciative of the numbers that are produced, and
Mhm.
I try not to write off anyone. I mean, look, I know myself who who maybe I would want to cite or whatever, but I try to pay attention to everything and try to look for opinions that are sort of contradictory. Again, that's why I find Trafalgar to be sort of interesting, even though
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure 100% as to what their methodology is. But the other thing too is that, look, we're in the president lost the popular vote. He's
Mhm.
never shown that he really could get his approval over 45%.
Yep.
We're in a national crisis that most people think he's handled poorly. That's sort of a scenario where you think an incumbent would have a hard time matching his previous support, let alone adding to it. So
Yeah.
sometimes you have to take a step back and say, well, do these numbers, is it a plausible reality that Trump could be losing support from white voters? Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at Biden's on a bus tour through Pennsylvania and Ohio right now. So, some of the criticism where Hillary Clinton didn't end up in Wisconsin once, or, I think she didn't go to Wisconsin. Biden, it seems like the campaign is trying to mitigate that possibility again. To that point about what you were saying about, weighing all the information, Aiden Kilpatrick, one of our traders, and I really like this question. I think it's fun. What is the weirdest successful predictive measure you've analyzed in predicting an election?
There's a group that they were basically using social media and sort of the intensity of the language on social media as a way to sort of measure enthusiasm. And actually, I was in touch with them in like 2017, 2018. And I actually don't even know what they're up to now. That's why I'm not using their name. But they got some of it. They had a good sense of the Virginia governor's race in 2017. They had a good sense of the Doug Jones upset in 2017 as well for Alabama Senate. So that was a new one. I thought it was kind of interesting.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question before we get to all of our trader questions. The president didn't seem to definitively say he would accept the election results last night. There's a lot of this whole go in and watch the polls. Certainly each state runs their elections. There are myriad of different rules. And, if anybody's looked into any of this stuff, it's complicated and very technical. Are you concerned about the integrity of our election? And if so, why? And if not, why?
I'm concerned about some of the president's statements and some of the things that he might be egging on his supporters to do. And look, I do think also a lot of these states going to heavier mail balloting than they're used to. I'd say particularly, early in mail-in voting was not a huge part of voting in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania until now. A few of those states had sort of changed their rules prior to the pandemic, so they were kind of going to get in the process of having more absentee and early voting. And so I worry about them being able to process that, but I think they'll be okay. And I think that the results that we had from the primaries from those states, in some cases, the results were somewhat delayed. But I do kind of worry that, we've got a conspiracy-minded public. The president himself is very conspiracy-minded. He is very irresponsible in his public statements, and he is going to say stuff that is intended to benefit himself. And so this is the example I bring up is of what we might expect is that, so in Pennsylvania in the primary in June, it seemed on election day that many more registered Republicans had voted than registered Democrats. And then as the mail-in ballots trickled in, and we know that Democrats are going to be much likelier to use that method based on polling and ballot requests and whatnot. As the results trickled in over the course of a few weeks, it turned out that significantly more registered Democrats had voted than registered Republicans. Well, you could imagine a scenario where on election night, Pennsylvania looks very Republican leaning, and people are urging calm, and the president says, I'm declaring victory in Pennsylvania. I won the state, even though there might not be any votes from Philadelphia in or something like that. I mean, that's the sort of thing that you can imagine him saying, and it doesn't have any legal value, I guess, but it will lead to a tricky and confusing kind of period.
Yeah, and I think we had Liz Landers on from Vice, a fantastic reporter, and she said, one of the things that we've been cautioned to do is to continue to inform people that there may not be a result on election night, and just get prepared for that. Certainly, states out west that have done mail-in balloting traditionally. I live in Montana, so there's 1 million people here. It's much lower population and much lower logistical hurdles than trying to do something like this in Pennsylvania for the first time. So we have some questions from our traders. We'll pop into these. Andrew Miller said, as you consider the House elections and in light of recent reporting on House Democrats going on the offense in GOP strongholds such as Alaska, do House Democrats or incumbents have anything to fear? Could they also face an October surprise?
There are some kind of wild card House races coming into play. The Republicans are running a play for, I guess, Ron Kine in Wisconsin 3, Congressional Leadership Fund just put in, I think, $2 million there. I don't quite know what's going on. I personally think Kine will be okay myself, but that's sort of a sleeper race to watch. There are a few Democrats in kind of heavily Latino seats that seem to be facing pretty competitive reelection challenges. TJ Cox in California 21, he was kind of a fluke winner, even though that district is pretty Democratic at the presidential level. He's facing David Valdeo, the former office holder there, who I think is locally popular. Debbie Mercasel Powell in South Florida. And I think it is real that Biden is probably not going to do quite as well in South Florida as Hillary Clinton did. And we also know that Republicans still maintain some down ballot strength there with voters of Cuban ancestry. So those are some kind of upset House races to watch. I personally think almost every Democratic incumbent is in good shape to win. That's not to say all of them will win. I don't think all of them will win. But there are only a handful that seem to be in very real trouble.
Moving on, which state do you think will be the most surprisingly competitive? I think you mentioned Nevada, but I don't know if that's what you might think.
Yeah, I think Nevada is a decent candidate if you're looking for a place where maybe Trump could do a little bit better than you might expect. I will say, if things get out of hand for the president and he is really struggling, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Biden could potentially come close in Montana or Alaska or even South Carolina. It's interesting that whole Atlantic seaboard. Virginia kind of leading the way in the southern part of the Atlantic states. South Carolina is the one state that really stands out as being really kind of still like kind of blood red. I mean, Georgia's Republican and North Carolina is too, but they're all kind of changing in certain ways. And if things really get out of hand for Trump, maybe you'd see a state like that get very close. Quinnipiac had Trump up only one today, which I don't. That seems a little unrealistic to me. Particularly because North Carolina still seems so close, and you would think that North Carolina would still vote much more Democratic than South Carolina does. But if you're looking for like deep sleeper dark horses, Alaska, Montana, South Carolina, those are a couple that I would flag.
I'd be curious. I'm in Montana, obviously, and the Senate race has been kind of close. There are a lot of ticket splitters here. People would vote Biden, Daines, or Bullock, Trump. That race, obviously, I've looked at some polling recently that has it much closer than our markets do. But we've also seen a large influx of COVID people coming in and perhaps moving here and changing. This seems like a wild card to me. But does the COVID migration impact? I mean, there's only 1 million people in Montana. So how does that COVID migration that probably nobody's thinking about, does that have an impact, do you think?
I don't know enough about, how many people moved, how many of those people actually register. I mean, I remember when there was a bad hurricane in Puerto Rico a couple years
Mhm.
ago, there were supposedly a number of Puerto Ricans who moved to Florida, and that was seen as some sort of boon to the Democrats. And honestly, I don't think it was. And actually, given that Rick Scott did a little bit better in the Orlando area, where there's a heavy Puerto Rican population, than maybe he should have against Bill Nelson. I
Yeah.
almost wonder if the influx of those folks actually helped Rick Scott win. I mean, I just don't know.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so, I just don't have any feel for that. I mean, there have been some people talking about, oh, well, some people are leaving New York City. Does that make New York more competitive or something like that? I mean, first of all, I can't imagine that was that heavy of an influx of people leaving New York for something like that to happen.
Yeah.
But it's also a pretty hard thing to like get really reliable, good numbers on. And of course,
Mhm.
to leave, they have to, establish a residency in the other state and register to vote, and then actually follow through with voting. So,
Yeah.
my guess is it's probably not that big of a
Probably
deal. It's
negligible.
also
Yeah.
a hard thing to try to figure out.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're leaving New York City, where are you going? New Jersey or Connecticut? I mean, you're not gonna
Yeah,
turn
right,
each of
right.
those states any color. Um, so moving on, Andrew Owen said, my question for Kyle is, what day do you basically call it for Biden if the poll numbers now don't change? By what day is it too late for Trump to make a difference because too many people have voted?
I don't know if I would put a day on it. I mean, and I also, I'm not used to the rhythms of the election that we're going to be having, because
Yeah.
I'm not used to all of these. The volume of early voting and mail-in voting is going to be higher than normal. I think the numbers need to start moving for the president, though. I mean, as look, the president gets a good poll here and a good poll there, but on balance, most of them are pretty good for Biden. And in order for the president to sort of confound the polls, I do think the polls probably have to get closer again,
Mhm.
unless people are just totally missing the boat on white voters. And again, there's not. That's just a worry of mine. I don't have any evidence to suggest that that's actually happening.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, and the debate maybe was an opportunity to do that. I guess I have to sort of cop out. I don't have a specific date that I would suggest.
Yeah.
But we're running out of time here, and again, it's been a very steady kind of election too.
Well, and so I think, you're looking, I mean, what sort of criteria are you weighing? You're weighing how many early votes have been returned. If you've had a certain percentage of early voting, and I think in some states you can find out if Democrats have returned more early votes than
A lot of
Republicans.
people are able to model it too. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can start to kind of look at things like that, but certainly, I mean, there's still going to be a lot of curveballs in this election, I think. Okay, so we have another question from, Steve Delano from latestpollresults.com. He says, currently Sabato has a Senate 49-49 with 2 toss-ups, Iowa and North Carolina. If tonight was election eve, how would you move these races and why?
I think I'd split them one apiece. I think I'd probably pick the Democrats in North Carolina and the Republicans in Iowa. Now, I have to say, though, that if anything, the trajectory in both those races maybe a little bit better for the Democrats. Like I'm sort of coming around a little bit on Iowa as more of kind of a toss up for president, which I think impacts the Senate race. I mean, I see you guys actually have Democrats favored in Iowa, which I don't think is a crazy position based on the polling. I guess you might think that eventually those Senate races will go the same way that the presidential race in those states ends up going. But yeah, I would split them 50-50. All right, split them 1-1, and with North Carolina likely to go Democratic and Iowa likelier to go Republican. But you've got these leans Republican races out there, like for us, Georgia and South Carolina and Montana, and some other ones that are of interest. So that's where you can maybe see if the Democrats have a really good night. Instead of us talking about 50 Democratic Senate seats, maybe we're talking about 55. Again, that's not something I'd project right now, but if this turns into 2008, the Democrats ended up kind of blowing it out in the Senate, blowing it out in the House and the Electoral College, and that is one of the possibilities that we could have here.
So the second question we have is looking into your crystal ball on election eve, 33 days from today. Thank God, by the way. What trends or changes do you anticipate would look different from today's outlook?
I think I'm probably a little bit more confident in Biden than maybe I was 2 or 3 weeks ago. In some ways, Justice Ginsburg's passing actually made me think it was maybe a little bit likelier for Biden to win, just because to the extent that it has an impact. I think maybe Democrats are likely to be mad about it, and Republicans are maybe likely to be contented about it. And so maybe that has some sort of impact, although again, it might just be sort of a status quo sort of thing. But the things that I could sort of foresee happening would involve maybe some of those Senate races I was just talking about. Some of these ones that are where we have the Republicans favored, that may actually be more like legitimate sort of toss-ups. So again, that's one trajectory I can imagine, and that might also apply to the House too, because most of us have thought for the whole cycle, and I still think this way, that there would not be that much net change in the House, and I thought for a while that the Democrats were in better position to maybe net a handful of seats. Well, what if it ends up being like 15, which I think it could be, because there are enough kind of fringe Democratic targets that suddenly aren't so fringe anymore. That you're starting to see outside money come in some places like Virginia 5, for instance, which is where the Center for Politics is in UVA. Jim Hagedorn in Minnesota 1 is another one. And there are probably 10 other races that you could sort of put into that bucket. So again, there's, if Biden, pushes this thing out a little bit, there are down ballot consequences in all likelihood.
With the outside money, I mean, we've seen Republicans investing heavily in Senate races. You've seen Bloomberg put in a bunch of money into Florida for Biden, or maybe not for Biden, maybe down ballot. But how much does that outside money impact these races?
I think it can matter. I mean, I think there's some Democrats who believe that Bloomberg's late infusion of money in some House races in 2018 may have, pushed the gains from maybe 35 to 40. Like Kendra Horn, for instance, in Oklahoma 5. I mean, there's been pretty decent reporting suggesting that. I guess you never know exactly the effect of the money, but that Bloomberg came in heavy for her at the end, and very well may have been sort of responsible for getting her elected. I don't know what exactly Bloomberg's going to be doing in the House, but it wouldn't surprise me to see him making some big late investments in some of these races that end up being very helpful to Democrats. So, again, if you do get to a situation where Democrats net double-digit seats, maybe it's because Bloomberg came in and essentially bought a few of them.
Yeah. Well, and if you're looking for indicators, odd predictive indicators, it might be interesting to be looking at where these infusions of cash are being put. So we're going to move to the lightning round. John Phillips usually does this. I'm really bad at it, but he is otherwise engaged. So let's watch me be bad at this. So Ohio is in play right now. I think it was a little bit lower today. It's 59.40. Where would you buy here? Would you buy it 59 cents Republican? Would you buy 40 cents Democratic?
So this is Iowa.
Oh, sorry, it should be the Ohio.
That's okay.
So we'll move to Ohio in a minute.
Okay.
Last I saw it was 56.45 in favor of Republicans. There we go.
I mean, that still seems decent to me for Republicans. I think it does reflect the genuine uncertainty, but also the fact that the state is probably still a little bit better for Trump. Also, if you are assuming that maybe the polls are missing a little bit of the Trump vote, not necessarily in a huge way, all of a sudden Ohio goes from being maybe 50-50 to being 2 to 3 points for Trump, and that's enough.
Yeah, for sure. Iowa, we can go back to Iowa. This electoral college market gets interesting periodically when it seems like Trump hits more shaky ground. Where are you buying and selling? What's your take on whether or not the GOP can hang on here?
I think Iowa, I would actually give, I personally would maybe reverse Ohio and Iowa. I mean, they're very similar, but this indicates that Trump's slightly more favored in Iowa. I think I would maybe make him, again, I might switch that. So from that standpoint, maybe I would say actually that Biden might be the better buy here.
Mm. So there's better chances for Biden. Is there a price that's too high to buy Democratic at in Iowa?
I mean, look, if it were in the high 40s, I think. And again, I don't bet on politics myself. We have company policy about that, but I'm happy to talk about these odds, and I find them interesting. If it's in the high 40s, I think I probably would stick with Trump. But 40 cents seems pretty decent here, I think.
Yeah. So let's say in Iowa for the Senate race, we talked a little bit about this. Where are you buying or selling? We've got 55-45.
So I think there's too much of a difference here between the presidential odds at 40 and Teresa Greenfield's odds at 55. So actually, I think I'd probably buy Ernst in this situation.
Interesting. It's interesting with Ernst. I mean, she's only this is one term, right?
And she ran what was regarded as an impressive race in 2014, although that was also just a horrible Democratic year in a lot of different ways. And in some ways, particularly in a state like Iowa, kind of foreshadowed how badly they did in 2016. But then there was a definite bounce back for Democrats in Iowa in 2018.
Is this a Trump effect? Or is it a reflection of her work in the Senate? I mean, what's going on here?
I'm not exactly sure why Ernst is doing a little bit worse than Trump in the state. It doesn't. It doesn't necessarily compute for me all that much. She has had a number of kind of, I don't know, bizarre or controversial statements, but her problems sort of precede that. So I'm not exactly sure, but Iowa is a state too where if there are disruptions in the agricultural economy and we've got these tariff issues, you do sometimes see it in the farm states, and that could be a possibility here. There's to me, kind of a famous example, and that was 1988 when a lot of the ag community really disliked the Reagan administration policies on certain things. And Iowa has never voted more Democratic relative to the nation than it did in 1988. So did Wisconsin and Minnesota, and I think that there were agriculture issues at play there. So the ag stuff is not something I feel like I'm super grounded in, but you do see sort of anecdotal stories about, farmers being upset and whatnot, and maybe that's driving this to some degree.
Yeah, I actually covered some of the grain and ag stuff out here in rural Montana. And one of the things that, and I drawing parallels between farming in Montana and Iowa can be a bit tricky, but one of the things that they talked about with the grain manufacturers or whatever the association was that wheat you can get from Canada and sell to China. It's essentially the same wheat that you're selling. And so the big thing are these relationships that have been built over decades. And so if suddenly you can buy from Canada, you lose that relationship. And it has a long-term effect in places, I'd imagine, like Iowa. But everybody's different, every state's different, and farming is something I don't like to wade too much into because it scares the hell out of me and I don't know enough about it. So, but I thought anecdotally that was something that always stuck with me. Okay, so Alaska Senate race. It seems awfully tight in the markets for the GOP in Alaska. What's happening here, and are you a buyer for GOP or a seller?
So this race has started to attract some investment from outside. I think Senate Leadership Fund, the big outside Republican group, has waded in. Sullivan has taken on a little bit of fire over a kind of a controversial mining project there. I think the Republicans are still favored. This price actually seems pretty reasonable to me. But it is kind of a sleeper race, and I think it's also become sort of like a favorite race for some of the election Twitter gang. And Alaska is also kind of a quirky state. It's a state that even though it's conservative and Republican, it's also kind of has a libertarian feel to it. And I do wonder if maybe the court fight, and if Roe v. Wade becomes prominent in that Alaska is not a kind of a conservative or socially conservative evangelical kind of state. And I wonder if that maybe plays some sort of role here.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, everybody says Montana is Alaska light, and to say they're libertarian, I think is a bit of an understatement. There's quirky.
I think there are a lot of commonalities between the two states, and they both have competitive U.S. House at large races, and they both have competitive Senate races.
Yeah. Okay. So same with Georgia general. Where are you buying and selling here?
This is for the Senate race. The thing is that I think it's probably going to go to a runoff, and the history suggests the Republicans have a little bit of an advantage in the runoff.
Mm.
I guess the price seems reasonable to me. I mean, the third party candidate is a libertarian, so maybe that gives John Ossoff actually a path to 50%. But Perdue is also one Republican who seems to be doing a little bit better than Trump. I mean, you could find Republicans all over the map who are doing worse than Trump in the Senate, but Perdue might be doing a little bit better.
Interesting.
Which would almost certainly prevent Ossoff from getting over 50, even if they're and forcing a runoff.
So we have a couple other questions if you have time. I don't want to take up too much of your time. We did have one trader wanted us to ask about the Kansas Senate race. If we can pull that one up for a second, Will. And in the meantime, while Will is pulling that up, I thought this was a good one. In Frank Lentz's undecided voters focus group yesterday, the general sentiment was that they felt they could not trust either candidate and couldn't tell what parts of the debates were true. Do you have any insights or ideas on how debate moderators or TV channels should fact check real time when voters are actually watching? My only insight from that is it's damn impossible. So
yeah, I think it's really hard to ask the moderators to do that. I mean, I guess you could do it through the Chiron on TV, but also like fact checking is sometimes presented as this sort of like black and white kind of issue when I think reasonable people can sometimes disagree as to how factual a statement is. And a lot of politicians are pretty good at sort of like artfully lying or kind of obfuscating, and they say something that's technically true but lacks context. And I think it's just pretty hard. I mean, the president, I think, is different in that he is such an unreliable narrator, more so than any major politician I've ever seen. And so maybe he necessitates some sort of extraordinary sort of intervention. But the thing is that Republicans for years and years have felt like the media is biased against them, which I think in some ways reasonably, in some ways not. And they now have this president they support who, because because he lies so much, he generates this disproportionately negative coverage from the press, which to Republicans reinforces the fact that they think the press is biased. And if you're inserting a lot of fact checking into the debates, you're probably going to look biased to a lot of people by doing that. So I just don't have good answers to it.
Yeah, I think logistically, and also, I mean, if your goal in the press is to be honest and truthful, the nuance, like you talked about, is it would take away from the candidate's ability to debate. You'd spend the entire time fact checking. That's why they do it in the Post. Tom Foreman does a great job of it on CNN often when he does it. But yeah, I think that it's also, you watch any interview, right? Like you don't fact check your entire way through an interview. You let candidates say what they say and let the public decide. So I think that it's an interesting question, but it's also a really fine line between how much is the press injecting themselves into the election. So, and see if we can do one more. I like this one as well. It's also from Sam. Last one, a betting odds question. PredictIt and other betting markets seem to be baking in a multi-point Democrat skew in the polls, and betting odds show less confidence in Biden and down ballot Dems than Sabato, Cook, and 538 and other forecasters. Do you think betting markets are betting too highly on a repeat of the 2016 Dem skewed polling errors? How is Sabato crystal ball accounting adjusting for 2016?
Look, I mean, I think I've mentioned a few times as we've been talking here, my sort of worries about that, but those worries have not been enough for us to, we've had Biden up for months, at a higher number of electoral votes in our ratings than Trump. And so if we really thought that was as big of a problem, our ratings would look different, I think. So we're trying to take that into account. But also, you could make an argument that maybe we should have, instead of having Biden around 270, we should have him around 350. You could make that argument. But I think that part of the caution from the 2016 experience is part of the reason why we don't have it that way.
Yeah. I want to ask you more questions. I don't want to keep you here all night. I'm sure you have better things to do than talk to us. So thank you so much, Kyle Kondik, for your time. We can't thank you enough. And we have all of your information over here. Follow Kyle on Twitter. Check out Sabato's Crystal Ball. I'm sure a lot of our traders are already, dedicated readers. And thank you so much.
Just a few other things to plug, and thanks for having me.
Please plug
If you
away.
want to subscribe to the Crystal Ball, centerforpolitics.org/Crystal Ball, you can just enter your email address in there. We also have been doing a weekly webinar at 2 p.m. on Thursdays. It's available, after that time on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is UVACFP. And there's a direct link to that in our Crystal Ball newsletter coming out in the morning. That's also available audio only as podcasts, so at Apple, Spotify, all sorts of podcast providers.
Yeah, it seems like we're all kind of being able to put out some great stuff here in the middle of this crazy ass pandemic. So
yeah, I mean, I think that from our own perspective, we've probably produced more this year than we have in the past, just because we're trying to get out there in the midst of not being able to do in-person things.
Well, and having your analysis and numbers cuts through a lot of the nonsense out there. So I always enjoy reading what you guys put out, and we'll make sure that all of that information is in the newsletter on Friday. So if you guys didn't get that down, we'll have it all plugged in there. So Kyle Kondik, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.